installing and configuring Citrix plugins. All right, so let's take a step back here and just take a look at where we're at in this process. So far, we've begun the process of really installing Citrix XenApp, and then once we did that, we licensed it, and then we talked about the delivery services console, and we went through some of those introductory policy settings activities that configure XenApp itself to prepare it for use. That's just getting XenApp ready for the applications. Once XenApp is ready, we went through and installed an application, and probably a couple of applications if you worked a little bit on your own. And now we're ready to allow clients to connect into this infrastructure. Obviously, for clients to connect into that infrastructure, they have to have some sort of agent or plugin that sits at their end of the equation so that that plugin can facilitate the connection to the Citrix XenApp infrastructure. That's what we're going to do in this nugget. We have those applications that are ready to go and ready for deployment, but we don't really have anything yet at the client side to essentially allow the connection to occur. Now, what's interesting, not only for your own knowledge, but also for the exam, is that there are a lot of different plugins that you have to be aware of. And, well, if you've played with Citrix's technologies for any period of time, one of the things that you probably know is that Citrix has this fascination with changing the names of their technologies from version to version. And so the plugins used to be thought of as clients, and now they're thought of as receiver, and all sorts of various names that really just mean some piece of code that exists at the client side to again facilitate that connection. You need to know and understand the differences between Citrix's many different plugins, and you also need to be aware that some plugins that are available today are not necessarily those that are really talked about on the exam. Now, in this nugget and in this entire series, we're going to be working with what you see up here, the online plugin, web plugin, and also the offline plugin. These are the plugins that handle hosted applications and also handle streamed applications down to the client. And in the verbiage of the exam, you're going to hear a lot about these online plugins and offline plugins. Now, there is a third plugin that is now called the Dazzle plugin, but used to be called the Self-Service plugin. But this plugin, we're not really going to talk about it at all. In fact, this is the only time you're going to hear about this plugin. The Dazzle plugin is an additional plugin that is used so that users can do self-service activities for the applications they need. In the traditional scenario, you, the administrator, will be creating applications and provisioning those applications to users, but there is an additional scenario where you may just create applications and then allow users to connect to those applications or download those applications on their own. That's the self-service plugin, or what is now called Citrix Dazzle. As you can imagine, all of these different plugins, an online, an offline, a web, and a Dazzle, all of these mean a lot of additional installations that are required at the client side to support all these delivery possibilities. So Citrix took one step further and then created what's now called Citrix Receiver. All you really need to know when it comes to Citrix Receiver is that the receiver client is sort of an umbrella client that within it allows you to install all the other clients. So be aware that there are all of these clients out there, all of these plugins out there, and that each performs a specific function, including this receiver plugin, which is sort of the wraparound client that envelops them all. In this nugget, we're going to talk about how to install those clients, and we're going to go through it through a couple of different perspectives. We're going to go through a manual installation. You'll find with the online plugin that the manual installation is relatively easy. These days, you just double-click it and it automatically installs without much extra questions, in fact, without any extra questions. The offline plugin has a few extra questions it requires. Just like with any installation, there are a number of different things that you can configure at the point of installation. And so I want to also show you some of the settings that can be customized at the command line so that when you're either deploying this through some automated solution, or if you just want to create some nice nifty script to install the plugins, you can do so and automatically add in those settings. There is also the capability to extract the individual components out of the installation and then install those components separately. You'll see down here there's a section that deals with extracting the MSI files for individual installation. Now, as you can see here, we have the ICA web wrapper and the single service and the generic USB desktop viewer. All of these are individual MSIs that are all sucked together inside this Citrix Online plugin. And you have the ability to actually go through and extract extract those files out and install them separately if you want. What this allows you to do is further customize your installation so that users won't have access to the stuff that you don't think that they need. Once the client's completely installed, you also have the ability to manage the configuration of that client using group policy. Now, inside of any installation, you're going to find an icaclient.adm file, which is an ADM template that injects right into group policy, which will allow you to manage that client as long as you target that group policy to a set of workstations. And I'm going to show you what this looks like and then kind of float through a couple of the different settings. Now, as you get that client installed, obviously you've got some configuration for the client, but you also then need to point that client to a XenApp infrastructure so that it can receive the applications that you've made available. Doing so requires a server that has the Citrix web interface installed onto it. Now, we've installed that piece, but we haven't configured it yet for plugin management. We're going to do that also in this nugget so that we can eventually point that client to XenApp and see the applications we have available. So all this stuff we're going to work on here in nugget number 10, but it all starts really with taking a look at some of the manual installations that we can do for the client. Now, for this nugget, we're going to take a look more at the client side here. And so what I have is an instance of Windows 7. And in this instance of Windows 7, you can see I've downloaded the Citrix Online plugin and also the Citrix Offline plugin. If I wanted to right now, I could just simply double-click the Citrix Online plugin and begin its installation. There's really not that much to talk about because it does most of the installation without really prompting you with anything to insert or any questions to ask. Now, what I do want to show you, however, is that if you interrogate that installation, I'm going to go to CD Desktop here and then take a look at the Citrix Online plugin full. And if I take a look at /?, it's going to expose a number of additional supported parameters that are available for installing this plugin. Now, obviously, there's the help file here and uninstall. This /silent will suppress all the dialogues, and /no-reboot will suppress all the reboots as well. And then also I talked about how you can extract those different pieces into an existing folder. You're going to need to know how to do this primarily for the tasks, but also in case you need to extract those MSIs out. Really, if you do /extract in a folder, it's going to extract all those MSI files out into a folder that you can later add into your application deployment solution for installing separately. There are a number of MSI property values as well that can configure certain elements of the Citrix client at installation. I'll show you what those property values could potentially be here. But for the most part, what you really want to do is double-click the exe file and potentially choose the /silent switch if you're deploying it through an automated solution, and that will install the client. Here, I'll show you how easy it can be. If I go ahead and close these down and double-click the client here, you'll see that the client simply goes through installing without really asking you much in the way of questions. Now, what I need to show you here, however, is that there are a number of different elements at the command line that can be used for installing the Citrix Online plugin. A couple of things you got to be aware of. Number one, there are two different types of online plugins. The first of which is called the full plugin, which includes all the components, and the second is called the web plugin, which includes only a very basic set of components for connecting up with web interface. Those are two separate executable files which you can use for installing one of those two variants. We've already talked here about the /?and /no-reboot and silent switches, but there are also a number of different properties and values that you can set here as well. The install directory, for example, if you want to name the client something else other than the computer name, by default, the default value is going to be whatever the name of the computer is. Do we want to enable a dynamic client name? Do we want to add in local features here, or enable the single sign-on features or Kerberos? Even down here, there's some additional things here with Novell and server location and whether or not you want to start the connection center or not. All of these are pieces that you can add in as properties and values, MSI properties and values, at the time of installation. So these come in handy, again, if you want to customize that installation as you deploy it to your Windows 7 or other Windows desktops. What's interesting, however, is that if I just simply double-click the online functionality, right now, as you can see, the installation is completed successfully. There's really, as I said, not that much that needs to occur for you to get that online plugin deployed out to your users. If you want to make it silent, all you need to do is, again, add the /silent switch to get it going. The real interesting pieces, however, happen when you get past the installation part and you start thinking about the customization of that client. With this version of the client, most of the customization is really going to be done using group policy. Let me go ahead and show you how that works. So here I have my server XA Nugget 1, that same XenApp server that we've been working with before. Recall that when you install XenApp, it automatically installs the plugins for you. So those plugins are going to be available right away on the computer. If I go to computer and hard disk here and I take a look at program files x86 and then Citrix, and then I'm looking here for the plugin here, ICA client, and I'm looking here for a folder called configuration. Inside of this configuration folder, you'll find this file called icaclient.adm. Now, if you play with group policy and the custom creation of group policy, you know that an ADM file can be added in as an administrative template file for doing more customized things inside of group policy. Native group policy alone only works with Microsoft software because, well, native group policy is made by Microsoft. We need this ADM file because the ADM file contains the questions that we want to eventually answer and deploy through group policy. Let's actually take a look at that here. I'm going to open up the Group Policy Management console, and I'm going to import in this ADM file so we can take a look at the different things that Citrix can configure via this ADM file. Let me go ahead and just modify the default domain policy. Again, you probably won't be doing this in your organization. You'll probably create your own separate policy. But what I want to do is go to Computer Configuration, and under Policies, Administrative Templates, right-click and choose to Add Remove Templates. Now you'll see here that the ICA client template has been added in to this default domain policy. If you haven't added it in yet, you can click the Add button and simply go to the correct location and find that ADM file. Adding it into the policy means that if I expose administrative templates down here, I have the ability to go down to Classic Administrative Templates and Citrix Components to view some of the configurations for the Citrix Online plugin. Let me scroll these over here to the right so you can take a look at all these elements that are exposed. For the online plugin, you'll notice that there are a number of different elements that I've already seen before when I took a look at Citrix policies, but there are the client-side pieces that are also required or can override those policies in some circumstances. What this allows me to do is create policies at the client side and at the server side for better administration of my clients. You'll see here I have things like allow client connections. I have network routing elements here which allow me to set up SSL and TLS, to configure a trusted server configuration, to set up session reliability and automatic reconnection, some proxy elements here if I have proxy things that I need to set up between the client and the server, even things like user authentication here. What types of authentication do I want to have when I'm trying to connect from client to server? Which types of client devices am I going to actually allow inside of that session? These are good ones here to take a look at because there are a number of these that are going to be different based off of where the client is. For example, client drive mapping here, once enabled, if you enable the policy, you can enable client drive mapping and then select which drives you do or do not want to map. These allow you to limit again down to the types of drives that you want based off of which organizational unit this client currently is in. I have the ability to set up image capture for if I'm doing the scanners or webcams or those sorts of things, as well as whether I want to turn on the client microphone or clipboard settings. Down here under user experience, I have a number of other elements that relate to what types of experience elements are going to be presented to that user. A lot of these have to do with the amount of quality for graphics and audio and display that I want to present to the client so that I can either restrict or not restrict the amount of bandwidth that client is using. For example, client graphics settings enable or disable a set of features that may or may not impact the amount of bandwidth that client requires. I'm not going to go through all of these like I went through them back on the last nugget, but be aware that all of these client settings are important to configure because they are going to need to work in hand with the policies that you've set at the server side. So be aware of this ADM file because you're going to want to use this ADM file to configure those clients. Now before we move on, I want to actually go back to the client here and talk a little bit about the offline plugin as well. Remember that the online plugin is used for connecting to hosted apps that are installed directly onto the XenApp server. The offline plugin is what is used when you want to stream an application down to that client using Citrix Streaming and a streaming profile. We've installed the online plugin so we can now connect to our XenApp server, but we can't yet actually use streamed applications because the offline plugin hasn't been installed. What's interesting about the offline offline plugin is that with this version, the offline plugin does not behave in the same way as the online plugin. You'll notice that the offline plugin has a few additional questions that are required in order to get it installed. We have to click through some screens here, click the next button, accept the license agreement, we have to choose a destination folder, and then ultimately install that client. Now what's interesting is if you take a look at Citrix's online product documentation library, it will tell you more information about how to deploy that Citrix offline plugin. You'll notice here that we have things like the /q switch for suppressing the extraction dialog box, and some other additional /qin, /qb elements that execute a completely silent installation. So if you're deploying that offline plugin, be aware that there are some additional and yet slightly different ways in which the offline plugin, at least with this version, needs to be deployed. The offline plugin is a very different installation than the online plugin, so you shouldn't confuse the fact that they're both from Citrix from meaning that they're both more or less the same sort of installation. Once that installation is complete, it's probably going to request a reboot here, and it says if we choose to continue, a reboot will be required to complete the setup. If I choose the OK button here, it's going to go through completing the installation and ultimately rebooting this desktop. So this completes installing both the online and the offline plugins for Citrix. As you can imagine, with all of these different plugins and all of these different mechanisms that the plugins have to be installed, you can understand why Citrix created this Citrix receiver functionality, because there's a lot of things you have to remember in order to get the clients installed. Now at this point, what we have is a set of clients that have been installed to a workstation, but we haven't actually configured these clients so that they can plug into our Citrix XenApp infrastructure. The very first thing we have to do is actually point that client to XenApp so that it can get its applications. Now there's a couple of ways that we need to do, or a couple of things that we need to do in order to be able to achieve this. And the first of these is to finish the configuration of Web Interface. Now you might not automatically associate Web Interface with these plugins because Web Interface, well, that conjures the notion of a website. But Web Interface, in addition to creating that website, also creates a location where clients can download the updated list of applications that are available for them. And so in order for the client to actually download that list, we actually have to start up a Web Interface site so that we can do management of those plugins. Let's go ahead and do that now. Let me switch back over here to my XenApp server. This is once again XA Nugget 1, that same XenApp server. And what I want to do is actually go back to the CD drive where I've installed the CD disk for XenApp server. And I'm going to run back to install XenApp server. It's going to launch that same role management thing that was working with before. And if you remember, we actually went through completing the configuration of XenApp and the license server, but we haven't completed the configuration for Web Interface. Let's go ahead and do that now by clicking the Configure button. What this is going to do is essentially set up the basic configuration for Web Interface management. You'll notice here that we have two websites. First, a XenApp website, and then a XenApp services site. The one that we're looking for in order to interface with the Citrix online plugin is a XenApp services site. And by creating this site becomes that location that the plugins then connect to gather those applications. Let me right-click here and choose to create a new site. This new site I'm going to associate with the default website because this default website is the same site that IIS is using because I've installed IIS to this server. And I'm going to use the path /citrix/pn agent. If you're curious, this used to be called the Program Neighborhood Agent, so that's why we still use the term pn agent here, even though it's a XenApp services site. And then the name is pn agent, just for now. If I choose the next button, that will actually confirm the settings for the new site and ultimately create that site. This step is necessary, even though it effectively creates an empty site. This step is necessary, even though it's creating what is effectively an empty site, because the next step is to point the client to this site once it's been created. Once the site's been created, we can then choose to configure the site as the next step in the process. You'll see here that we need to specify a server farm that this site will interface with. In this case, the farm name, we'll just call it Nugget Farm, because that's the same farm name that we were using before. We'll also need to identify the servers that are in this farm that the site will connect with. In this case, it's XA Nugget 1 is the server that we have in the Nugget farm. We're currently using 80 as the XML service port, and we are not securing the transport type, so we're not going to be using HTTPS or the SSL relay. If I choose the next button, I can choose whether I want to support online, offline, or both online and offline applications through this site. Now in this site, I want to be able to support both online and offline applications. I want to be able to have users connect into applications that are installed directly to the XenApp server, and I also want users to be able to stream applications down from that XenApp infrastructure. So for this reason, I'm going to choose a dual mode site so I can do both online and offline applications. If I choose the next button here, that completes the configuration of that XenApp site. With this configuration complete, let's actually flip back to our client. It's probably finished rebooting at this point, and see if that client's ready for connecting into this XenApp Services site. I'm going to flip back to the client here. It looks like the reboot is complete, and immediately, as soon as the client comes back online, it tells me that in order to be able to see new applications in your Start menu, you're going to need to enter the URL for a server computer. Let's go ahead and enter that URL in now. You'll see here that the Citrix Online plugin requires me to enter in a server address so that it can actually connect into a server to download the applications that are available. Let's connect to XA Nugget 1 and choose the Update button. You'll see here after a second or two, it connects in and allows me to, or provides a place for me to enter in my username and password. Let me do that now. Administrator, put in my password, and then the domain is going to be company.pri. And assuming that I've entered in my password correctly, this should connect up to the Citrix Online or the Citrix Services site that we just created. I've not got any error messages, so assuming we're probably okay. I can click the little up arrow here to take a look at the Citrix plugin, and I notice here that the Citrix plugin is currently logged on. If I right-click, I can take a look at the applications that are available to me. Right now I have a basic application calculator that's been created. I can refresh those applications, log off from the online site, I can reconnect in the online sessions, or even change the server. All of these capabilities are available to me because they're coming in from my XenApp infrastructure and being automatically added into my client. Now in the next nugget, we're going to talk about how you actually create those applications and then provision them down. So we're going to spend a little bit more time here in the client side in that next nugget. But be aware that this is actually how you'll go about installing the client and doing that initial configuration to prepare it for online applications. You'll also be excited to know that the same online plugin will be used for offline applications as well, those that are streamed down to the client. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about installing and configuring those Citrix plugins. We talked about how there are really a lot of Citrix plugins. There's an online and an offline and a web and a Dazzle and even a receiver plugin which sort of wraps them all around. We went through a manual installation, and then we talked a little bit about how you can customize that plugin and the installation of that plugin, both as it is installed and then later on using group policy. And then lastly, we completed the initial pointing of that client to our XenApp infrastructure by creating a web interface site for plugin management. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.